Okay, James chapter 4, down in verse 7 through 9 is really what we covered. And then we'll finish up really that section in verse 10. In verse 7 through 9, James makes the point, really I guess you could back it up to verse 6, but he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And he's going to cap that statement off down in verse 10. I guess you could put it this way. Verse 6 and verse 10 are like bookends. Verse 6 says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And verse 10 says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. So the whole point from verse 6 to verse 10 is humility. If you will be humble, God will give you grace. If you will be humble, God will fix the problem. If you will be humble, God will draw near to you. And so in verse 7, 8, and 9, he really describes the details of that, of what does it look like to be humble. And the first thing he says is submit to God. Humility involves submission. Submission is a big word. It's almost a swear word in our culture to submit to somebody. If you start talking about submission, people in our American mindset say, I will not submit to anyone. You know, we have statements like, don't tread on me, and things like that. We stand alone. Americans pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We have our own strength. And yet here it says, no, you have a master. Each and every one of us, if we're going to be humble, must accept we've got a master. Now, the difference is instead of your master being sin or selfishness or greed or anything of that type, because the Bible says, you really, if you serve anything, it becomes your master. If there's anything that you love and will follow after and do something for, it becomes your master. So every one of us has a master. But the difference is when you submit to God as your master, He's a godly master. He's a righteous master. He's got your best interest at heart, as opposed to money. He doesn't care about you. Selfishness, when you make yourself your God, well, good luck when you get into a problem that is beyond your power, which it doesn't take very much. Believe me, this week I've seen that more than most weeks. Sometimes stuff just happens that you cannot do anything about. And so if you say, I'm going to make myself my God, well, good luck. Good luck. That'll work fine until you have a problem. Or you're going to make other people your God. Whatever it is, anything that you worship, you've submitted to. And so he says, submit to God. That's what humility looks like, is submitting to God. And if you do that, he then says, resist the devil. So if you submit to God, then you're also saying, if God's my master, then who's not my master? The devil isn't. I'll resist him. I must serve God. I can't serve the devil. So whatever the devil's temptations are, now my mindset is, I have chosen God as my master, and whatever He wants me to do, I'll do. But whatever the devil's whisperings are for my life, I'm going to say no. And sometimes it's going to be hard to say no. Because the devil, when he has that whispering, that temptation, when he has those allurements of his, it is tempting. We call it temptation for a reason. There's something that we want about it. But he says, no, you're going to be humble and you're going to submit to God and you're going to resist whatever bait the devil puts on the hook. And he says, if you do that, the devil will flee from you. You want to get the devil to leave you alone, then just plant your feet and make it clear you're not moving. And once you do that, once you really plant your feet on something, all of a sudden, he starts to leave you alone. The devil only really likes to attack the weak of the flock. I guess you could put it that way. He's a roaring lion seeking who he can devour. That's what Scriptures say on it. He's a roaring lion seeking who he can devour. Well, what does a lion pick off? When a lion's hungry, what does it try and get? The weak. it's going to go for the weak gazelle. So whatever the weak areas are in your life, that's where he's going to go for. But if you have conviction in an area, you say, no, I'm going to be sexually moral, or I'm not going to let greed come into my life, and you have conviction on those things, or you say, no, I'm going to watch my tongue, and I'm no longer going to cuss or use the Lord's name in vain. I've planted my feet on that. Once you've really made that a conviction, guess what? He's not going to try and tempt you in that area anymore. That's not your weak area. He's going to move on to something he can get you in. So resist the devil, he'll flee from you. And it says, draw near to God, and he'll draw near to you. Now, how are you going to draw near to God? What did they start the section with and end the section with? How do we draw near to God? Humility. It's all about humility. If somebody will be humble and somebody will be honest, then they're going to be okay. And he says, cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. If you truly want to draw near to God, you're going to have to start dropping the baggage that's keeping you from Him. And what's the baggage? He says it's your sin. Cleanse your hands. Remove that wickedness from your life. Purify yourself. And it says, purify your heart, you double-minded. You can't be double-minded people. If you're going to be humble and submit to God, you can't be the type of person who says, yeah, but I don't know. I think I want to keep some of these sins. Well, I know I love God, but I don't know about how much do I love God. And we have that struggle internally. No, if there's a price tag on your soul, the devil will pay it. He'll write the check. You think about it, what was he willing to offer Jesus Christ for Jesus' soul? He said, if you'll just worship me one time, what will I give you? All the kingdoms of the earth in a moment of time. He showed him all those kings of the earth. He says, if that's what it takes to get Jesus, I'll give it. I'll give you that. So the devil is willing to give and pay the price to get you to submit to him. So if you've got a price tag on your soul, he's going to pay it. So you've got to stand firm. So cleanse your hands, purify your hearts, and no longer be double-minded where it's God some of the time and then not the rest of the time, where it's back and forth like that. No more vacillating. And then he says something really interesting in verse 9. He says, lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to heaviness. It's not often that we think of commanding somebody to be sad. Normally, what we try and do when you see somebody sad is you think, how can I make them happy? I want them to be happy. You're sad. I want you to be happy. Here is a verse that says the opposite. It says, no, there is a time, just like Psalm says, a time for everything. There is a time to lament and mourn and weep. And that time is when it comes to your sins. Purify your hands, cleanse your heart, you double-minded, lament and mourn and weep. No more just going through life happy-go-lucky. Oh, it's no big deal. No, sin is a big deal. And you'll never draw near to God until you really mourn over sin. One of the things that we have to do to be pleasing to God, to have that kind of relationship with God that we really, really want, is we have to really begin to just despise and be sickened by sin. Far too often, we look at sin as this thing that we can toy with, just like a little kid playing with fire. I grew up in a family of pyromaniacs. I've had forest rangers come up to all of the men in my family and say, I'm sorry, but you need to knock that fire down. The trees are burning 100 yards away. And I mean, that's just kind of the way it's always been. And so from the earliest age that I can remember, I was playing with fire. Because that's what Beyer men do. They play with fire. And as soon as you begin to play with fire, you've got one guarantee. You're going to get burned. That's the one guarantee. Now, you may or may not actually start a functional campfire, but you're going to get burned. Whenever you start to play with it, when you don't respect fire for its power, you're going to get burned. And that's what he says you need to do with sin. Lament, mourn, weep. It It's the exact same thing said over in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 when they talked about the man who had his father's wife in the congregation. He says, you should be mourning this. You should be upset that there's one of your ranks that is caught up in this sort of heinous sin. It should bother you. Don't go around like it's no big deal. And so we have to do this with our own lives. We have to, each of us, look ourselves in the mirror and say, what sin have I just allowed to propagate in my life? What sin have I allowed to just kind of grow unchecked and no more? I'm not going to let it happen anymore. I'm going to cut it out because it's keeping me from God. And so lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom or heaviness. That word gloom or heaviness, it really means shame, the casting down of the eyes. When somebody gets in trouble, you have a little boy especially, and they get in trouble, what do? Kind of look at the ground and kick it with their feet. And that's what he says, lament and mourn and weep, and let that joy be turned to that downcast eyes. Until you do that, you can't go anywhere. That is the beginning of a relationship with God. If you want to get closer to God, the very first thing you have to do is that. And so down in verse 10, he reiterates the point. He says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. That's a guarantee. I like guarantees. We live in a world full of non-guarantees, of maybes and kind ofs and probablys. And so anytime I can get a guarantee, if I do this, this will happen, I'm a very happy person. This is a guarantee. If you'll humble yourself before God, what will God do? 100%. What does He say He'll do? I'll lift you up. Now, I want to show you just a couple of verses that back up that idea. Go over to Psalm 51 with me. Now, in Psalm 51, this is a psalm that David wrote. And David wrote it after he had committed the sin with Bathsheba. He had slept with another man's wife. Then he had murdered that man. And Nathan the prophet had brought and come to David and basically shook him awake so that he realized how far he strayed from what God wanted him to be. And so Psalm 51 is a psalm that David wrote after it hit him, just square between the eyes. I'm a sinner. I'm not some great and mighty king who everything I do will always turn to gold. I have sinned. And down in verse 6, he makes a statement. He says, behold, you, that is God. God, you desire truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part you will make me to know wisdom. David, in the midst of Psalm 51 and talking about how he needs mercy and he needs forgiveness, he said, I finally realize it. God, you desire for me to have truth where? On the outer surface of me? What did Christ say about the man who cleaned the outside of the cup? He said, you clean the outside, but that's not good enough. Clean the in part. Psalm 51 verse 6, David says, I finally realize, God, what you desire from me is truth in my inward parts, all the way to the core of me. It can't be lip service. It can't be something that I talk about, I put on a good face that God, you matter to me. It has to be something you would do regardless of whether your friends did it, regardless of whether your spouse did it, regardless of whether your kids were for it, regardless of whether it was easy or hard. It has to be so ingrained in you that you care about God's truth that it's just down to the very core of you. And so David, all the way back in Psalm 51, understood what humility was because he'd been humbled. Another interesting verse on the subject, you go over to Isaiah chapter 1, down in verse 19. Of course, we're not going to look even close to all the verses on this concept of humility, but just a couple to back up what James is saying on how important it is to lament and mourn and weep over your sins. In Isaiah chapter 1, Isaiah is writing to Judah and talking to them about all their idolatry, and they would worship God, but then they'd also worship Baal and Molech and all these other idols. They say, oh yeah, we go and make our sacrifices at the temple, but then they go home to their house where they had their household idols. And he's telling them, you need to wash yourself. You need to make yourself clean. Sound a lot like James. What did James say? Cleanse your hands. And then down in verse 19, he says, if you are willing and obedient. Now that's really another way of talking about humility, isn't it? What's a humble man? He's a man who is willing to obey. He has a desire to submit, to do what God says. And so throughout your Bible, you'll see this concept over and over and over again. There's really two reasons why people don't become Christians. They're either not humble or they're not honest. Now there's lots of honest people. You run into people all over the world that are honest. They won't lie or cheat you on a deal. There's honest mechanics out there. There's dishonest ones, but there's lots of honest ones out there too. Lots of people don't cheat on their taxes. They care about truth, but they're not Christians. Well, why? Because if I'm honest, I care about truth, but I'm not humble enough to go looking for what I ought to be, then you're going to fall short. Pride is a very, very powerful thing, and it's one of the devil's greatest tools, and we've got to resist it. Anybody have any comments or questions? Yes?
Another example of being humble and being lifted up. Ahab was one of the worst kings of Israel. He was a horrible guy, but in 1 Kings 21, after Elijah brought the message that he was going to be condemned and his whole family was going to be destroyed,
Yep.
he humbled himself, and God spared him seeing all that stuff. He said, see how even Ahab humbled himself.
Yep.
Even the worst person humbles themselves beside God. God showed mercy.
God pays attention to that. He finds great joy in that. Absolutely right. Yeah.
I think another point that we were talking about Christ and his temptations, Satan didn't just flee after the first one. He tempted again and again. But then he did leave, and then God did send the angels to comfort him.
Yep. Absolutely.
I think as Christians we need to really look at that and know that the battle isn't going to be short. And in the long run, we're going to receive that comfort too.
Absolutely right. Yeah, resisting the devil isn't a one-time deal. That word resist in James is kind of an interesting word. It really comes to the idea of standing up. I'm going to stand and plant my feet right here, and you can't move me any more than you could move a mountain. And that's what Christ did. You know, here, first temptation, nope, this is what the Scripture says, no. Second temptation, no, this is what the Scripture says, I won't do it. Third temptation, over and over, he made it clear he was planting his feet. So yes, absolutely. Resisting is more than just a single decision. It's a life commitment to stand in one place, stand for God and nowhere else. Anybody else have any other comments or questions? Okay, well then let's go down to James chapter 4, and then we'll pick up down in verse 11. Now in verse 11, he's going to talk about, are you a judge of the law or are you a doer of the law? And this is a really important question, and because I guess I could put it this way, it's more fun to be a judge than a doer. Verse 11, he says, do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. Now, think of it this way. He says, don't speak evil of your brother. That is, don't tear your brother down and talk about him as a bad person. You can go back and Christ talked about the same thing. Be careful about the words you use with people. Don't call them fools or wicked people. And don't be rash with your words. And here he's specifically dealing with brothers. Now here's the thing. If you turn to a fellow Christian and either to their face or behind their back you say that they're worthless, or you say something that makes it clear that you think they are They are not good enough. Well, what has the Bible said about a Christian? Does the Bible say that if you're a Christian, you're good enough? It most certainly does. The Bible says very clearly that if you are a Christian, how does God feel about you? Feels quite pleasing, has quite positive feelings towards you. He calls you children. He says you're heirs. I've adopted you. I love you. So now if I go back and I look at my brother, if we look at some other Christian that we have some tiff with, some frustration with, maybe because their personality is different than us, or they're just different than us and have different struggles than us, and we say, that good for nothing, then what we're really saying is, I know better than God's law. Because God's law says that that person, with all of their flaws, all of their problems, all of their warts and scars and wounds, is good enough for God. That they came out of that water and they're trying to live faithfully, and God says, I accept them. And when you and I speak evil of our brother, what we're really saying is God's law doesn't know what it's talking about. Do you see that connection there? God says that they're good enough, and we say no. No, they may be a Christian, but that doesn't mean I need to like them. They may be my brother, but that doesn't mean I need to get along with them. And we put bitterness on our heart. What you've done at that point is you've made yourself a judge. You've said, I know more about people than the God who created man does. I know more about what makes a good person than the God who gave us the Bible does. And he says, so if you speak evil of your brother, he who speaks evil of brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. And he says, if you're a judge of the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. Now, here's the thing. If you go to, let's take a sports competition, because it's easier to think of a judge not being a doer in the case of a sporting event. You go and you watch tennis, and you got that guy sitting up. Do they just call him a referee in tennis? What do they call him? They've got a line judge in tennis. Anyways, whatever the name is, I don't play tennis. I don't watch tennis. All I know is they've got the guy sitting up there on that high chair, and then they've got judges around. And then they have 2 people or 4 people actually playing tennis. Now those judges, they're there to say the ball was in or the ball was out. The serve was good, the serve was bad. You get the point or you get the point. Now, if they're busy deciding who got the point or whether it was a foul or whether it was a good serve, are they playing the game? No. They're judges, not doers. If you see the guy in the referee uniform, you know one thing. He's not playing. He's not on either team. He's not a doer of the game. Now here in James, he says, if you go through life and that's what you do, every sermon you hear is for everybody else. Boy, so-and-so really needed that. Or you look at your brothers or sisters and you have condescension in your heart towards them, and or bitterness towards them. They did such and such to me, and they are not any good, and I may have to sit in the same building with them, but that doesn't mean I need to like them. You speak evil of your brother. You're no longer running the race, my friend. You've become a line judge. And that's a problem. Far too many congregations have been totally imploded. Do you realize that nobody can destroy our congregation but us? God has said, I'm not going to put your light out. He said, nobody around you can put your light out. It doesn't matter how much persecution there is. It wouldn't matter if every person in Monroe was opposed to the congregation here. If we stand fast and we're faithful to God and we behave how we ought, God says, I'll take care of you. The only people who can destroy a congregation are the people within it. And he says, if you become all of you a bunch of judges, critical of your brother. You know, there's a saying I read not too long ago, don't judge others because they sin differently than you. And I thought, well, that's a good point. It's a good point. Don't judge others because they sin differently than you. if they're serving God, they're trying to be faithful, they're trying to do right, and they have a different struggle than you, that doesn't make you better than them. That makes you different. So be a doer, not a judge. And it's so easy. Like I said, it's more fun to be a judge, isn't it? Because you don't have any skin in the game then, do you? If you're the judge, you just get to sit back and, oh, look at what that guy did. Nope, foul. Oh, look at that one. and you're always on the outside looking in. You're above it all. The judge is superior to things. You see that in the courtroom. We even get a visual of that in the courtroom because typically where does the judge sit? It's kind of on a platform, a little above everybody else. He says, do not do that. Because if you're a judge, you're not a doer. If you spend your whole life critical of everybody else, you're not running the race. And you don't get to heaven by being the judge, you get to heaven by running the race. Because if you run the race, at the very end, God says, here's your crown, and nobody can take it away from you. But if you're too busy judging everybody else, your chance will pass. And he double emphasizes that point in verse 12. He says, there is one lawgiver who's able to save and destroy. Who are you to judge another? There's one lawgiver. Now, there's only one person who has the authority and the wisdom to really make those judgment calls, and it's not us. Can you imagine being in God's shoes and on the day of judgment having to decide who goes to heaven and who doesn't? That's terrifying to me. Because even if you made one mistake, that's one person who would spend eternity in hell. That's one too many. One mistake is one too many, isn't it? See, sometimes you can't afford to make a mistake. And he says, when it comes to being a judge, only one being in the whole universe is qualified to do it, and it ain't you. So don't do it. Now, does that mean that we can't ever say there's right and wrong? Of course not. The Bible actually says that we have to judge sometimes, but it says judge with righteous judgment. If you're going to decide what's right and wrong, how are you going to do it? Take the law that the lawgiver gave you and use that. But if it comes down to opinion, you say, oh yeah, they're faithful, but they really ought to work harder. Well, that's your opinion. You don't know what they're doing behind the scenes. How many times in your own life have you been struggling with something and nobody else even knew how hard you were working? And it just seemed like you were treading water, but you were really, really working. We've got to be careful. That's James's point. We've got to be careful. There's one true lawgiver, and it is not the guy you see in the mirror. It's God. And Hebrews chapter 12, it backs up that point. Hebrews chapter 12, down in verse 23, it says that God is the judge of all. So that leaves out, if He's judge all, who's left to judge? Nobody. It's His job, not ours. And so He says, when you're dealing with your brother, look, if there's an open, flagrant sin and they say, I don't care about what God says, well, then we'll have to deal with it because now who are they shaking their fist at? The lawgiver. But if there's just a difference of opinion between you, or there's a difference of personality, or there's a difference of growth rate, or there's a difference of viewpoint and wisdom, show kindness. Don't speak evil of your brother. Get to doing and less judging. And when you do that, that's when a church grows. Church implodes when we do the opposite, and all we are is pointing fingers at everybody else. That's what destroys congregations. And I'm really very thankful to be a part of a group that takes very seriously the concept of everybody works, and everybody gives their best, and we give everybody benefit of the doubt. I've seen it done here time and time again. So keep it up, and let's do more. You can never have enough of that attitude. Any other comments or questions? Okay, down verse 13. So down in verse 13 he says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit. Now, this is another, as we've talked about as we go through James, these things are very loosely connected. What James is doing is saying, now here's a point, and here's a point, and here's a point. Here's all these different things that you need to be faithful. And they're very loosely connected. If you were to make a connection between verse 11 and 12, where he says, don't judge your brother because there's only one lawgiver, and down here in verse 13 where he's going to say, be careful about saying, I'm going to do this or that. I guess the only connection you could really find, that I've really found, let me put it that way, maybe you can find some I haven't, is verse 11 and 12, he just said, you're not the boss. Now, in verse 13, I'm going to explain to you once again how much not the boss you are. Not only shouldn't you judge your brother, you don't even know what's going on. Something that God tells us to do is to make plans, is to think ahead. In fact, when Christ talks about becoming a Christian, he says you ought to count the cost. Well, if you're going to count the cost for something, guess what? You are going to plan. And so, did this thing just make a weird sound?
I think it sounds like it just went dead.
Yeah, this one just went dead. I'm just hearing tinny in my ear. Okay. And so down here he says, planning is good. Now, that's not the point of verse 13 to say don't plan. The point is you have to keep in mind in any plan that you make that you do not have total control. Now, of course, the example I'm thinking of is just because this has been my week, and every time I tried to think of some other example, I couldn't because all I could think about is my dad. Here's my dad, 56th birthday coming up on August 25th, nearing retirement. Everything's looking good. He's been smart with his money. He's made good decisions. He's planned it out. He's a plotter. He's very much a planner. He taught me to be the same way. Just plan, think a year out, think 2 years out, think 5 years out, think 10 years out, think 20 years out, think as far out as you can imagine. That's the way my dad works. And then he wakes up one morning and he can't walk in a straight line. Goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, oh, by the way, you've got a brain tumor. And it's causing swelling in your brain. Now, he had a lot of plans. But then he got that news, and what happened to all those plans? Right out the window. Right out the window. So plans, they're perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with making plans. But verse 14, what does he say? Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. You just don't know. You don't know. And there are times that it hits us more than others that you don't know how much time you got. And so it's so very important that we live every moment so that we're prepared for that vapor to go out. Vapor is just steam, just like a tea kettle. See the steam? It goes up and it's gone. Even if you think of a lot of steam, you drive through industrial areas and they have the big stacks and there's steam coming out of those. How high up does even large amounts of steam go? You watch an old steam locomotive. No matter how much steam you pump out, how far does it go before it dissipates? 5 feet? 5 feet up in the air maybe? You just don't know. So when you make the plans, be very careful that they're not plans that will get to things that you need to get to now, later. Don't put off what needs to be done now, later. You've got no guarantees. There's just none. Absolutely no guarantees whatsoever. You don't even know what will happen tomorrow. Now, this is true. See, we try and think of ourselves as being fairly knowledgeable. I mean, you are all smart people. And so you get up in the morning and you can think and plan and make decisions and think down the line, but really when it comes down to it, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. You're going to wake up tomorrow, and I can guarantee you there are going to be some things that happen tomorrow that you did not plan on. Now, they may be insignificant things, but you still didn't plan on them. So you don't know what's going to even happen tomorrow. Now, if I can't plan that far in advance, what does that say about the guy who says, let's go to this city and we'll go over there for a year and we'll make a profit and then we'll come back and we'll use that profit to make more profit. And he's got big, big plans. If we know I don't know what's going to happen in a day, how silly does it look when I am so convinced that it'll always work out with my big long-term plans? So number one, don't put anything off that you should do today. Don't put it off till tomorrow. And then he says, down in verse 15, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. Now that's just a very small statement. If the Lord wills. Now, if the Lord wills. What's the difference between a guy who says, we're going to go to this city and we're going to work there for a year, and after that year we'll have made a profit and we'll come back here and we'll use that profit to make this plan? What's the difference between that guy and that guy who says, now, we're going to take and we're going to go over and we're going to go to this city and we're going to work there for a year and we're going to make a profit and then we're going to come back and use that profit to do some other things here. Of course, all Lord willing. Now just two words, Lord willing. What's the difference between the two? That's it. It's all about submission, isn't it? Now you're right back to that humility thing, aren't you? It's who's in charge. And I'm not in charge. And I don't know everything. And that's a big thing to accept in life. I don't know everything. And I don't have control of everything. And I got to be okay with that. It's a funny thing, but when you begin to do this in life, not only are you more pleasing to God, but you actually make better plans. Because all of your plans have built into it, God might have something different, and you become more flexible. And when you're more flexible, God can use you to do what He wills instead of what you will. And so, far too many heartaches have been caused just simply because we had an idea of how it's going to work out, and we had a vision for our life, and then God saw our plans and laughed. And He showed us, no, that's not the way it's going to work. And we have all this heartache, all of this struggle, all this turmoil for only one reason. Not because the plans changed, but because we weren't ready for the fact that the plans were going to change. If we just had in our heart in the beginning, well, God might have a different plan, and then I'll roll with that, it would have removed all of the turmoil because you would have been ready for the change. But we don't do that. We go in and say, I know, I'm right, this is the way it's going to be, and we're so confident in our own wisdom. And then when things don't work out, we're crushed, and we feel like failures, and we feel like our life didn't turn out the way we wanted it to, as opposed to saying, I'm a servant, Master, where can I go? What can I do? What would you have me to be? So as you look at it, it really comes down to humility, and he points that out down in verse 16, because he says, if you don't say, Lord willing, what are you doing? Verse 16, but now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. The guy who says, we're going to go to this city, we're going to make a profit, and he talks with just total confidence, he's a boasting man. He's arrogant. Now, it doesn't seem arrogant. He sounds confident, doesn't he? I mean, you hear a businessman who says, I've got plans, and here's the plan, and here's the 1-year plan, the 5-year plan, the 10-year plan, the 20-year plan. Businessman who does it, you say, now that guy's confident. I think I might want to invest with him. Scriptures say, no, if that's the way you think, is that you're in total control there, you're not confident, you're arrogant. And I think we're all guilty of it. We all have our days where we just feel totally in control. And in times of peace and prosperity, it's very easy to do that. One of the things the Scripture says is that in times of luxury, what happens to people is they get fattened hearts. It's just like here, instead of that having that humble heart God intended, it's like you get fat around it. And that fat is all of that security that we think we have in our peace and prosperity. He says, don't become arrogant. Don't get a fat heart. We talk about dieting the bodies. Heart needs a diet too sometimes. Just a reminder, just to remember, Lord willing. Just those two words, Lord willing, sets Christians who submit apart from when we speak in our arrogance. Down in verse 17, he says, therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Now, what does that have to do with everything else? Well, the guy who has all these plans, I'm going to go here, I'm going to do this. And then an opportunity comes up to do good. Now here's a guy, he's got plans. And just imagine a guy who packs his day so full of things that he's going to do that here he is, he's going along, and then he runs into somebody who runs into a friend or something like that during the day. And I've got all these errands I've got to do, but I run into a friend and they're sick and they're crying and they're hurting and they need somebody to talk to. But I can't do that because what am I doing? As long as they're crying and sad, what am I doing? Looking at my watch. No, I need to get on. I've got plans. Far too often there is good for us to do. There's opportunities to do great good. But we don't go through life saying, Lord willing. We go through saying, I got plans. I got stuff to do. I got a life. And then evangelism opportunities, they pass us by. Opportunities to do good to our fellow man, they pass us by. Opportunities to give a listening ear, they pass us by because they take time that we've already allotted to our plans, not God's plans. And so he says, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Probably one of the simplest examples of this is just looking at people in their lives with getting together and assembling on Sunday. Well, no, I'm too busy. I have this, I have that. We pack our lives full of things that are so important. Soccer games and sports and recreation and overtime and all these things that we just fill our life with. And what we do is we push out God. And you see it time and time again. Somebody just drifts away from the Lord because they were so busy. They didn't make time. And all those things distracted them from it. We can do it. You can do it in services. You can do it in spending time with Christians. You can do it in studying your Bible. You can do it with prayer. In every area of our spiritual life, you can just push God off because, hey, I've got plans. I've got things to do. And then when opportunities to do good come up, you don't have any room in your life for those. You're not flexible because you've got plans and God's not the master. It's no longer Lord willing. It's I'm going to go here and do this or do that. Anybody have any comments or questions? Yeah. Him who knows to do good.
And so I always thought of verse 17 is kind of, there's this person in verse preceding that's planning out their physical life. The right thing to do is prioritize. It's fine to plan, but prioritize.
Right.
Prioritizing your spiritual life and getting yourself ready for that, not getting all confused and distracted by your physical life.
Yeah. No, that's okay. You know what's right. Make room for it. You know the right thing. Let the Lord's will come first. And that's a good way to put it. Prioritize. So that you always have in your mind, I'm going to do this or that. But if something comes up that the Lord would have me to do instead, well, that jumps to the front of the pack. And I'm ready for that. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. I like that word prioritize. You're absolutely right. Any other comments or questions? Okay, we'll stop there. We'll pick up in James chapter 5, final chapter here next week.